Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. And today we have with us Lamar Pierce, Associate Professor of Strategy, Olin Business School, Washington University in St. Louis. And we'll be discussing his co-author study that he participated in that was recently released this past August, The Impact of Information Technology Monitoring on Employee Theft and Productivity. Before that, I'd like to read his bio. Lamar is an associate professor of strategy at Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. He teaches management in the BSBA program as well as ethics in organizations to executive MBA students at Olin and government executives at the Brookings Institution. Lamar uses both experimental and econometric methods to study how the same psychological and economic mechanisms that impact employee productivity also influence behavior detrimental to organizations. He focuses on designing firm policies that can both reduce employee misconduct and motivate productivity, a fundamental question for human resource management and organizational strategy. His work has appeared in outlets such as Management Science, Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, Psych Science, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and OPHDP, and has been featured in major newspapers and on National Public Radio. Lamar received his PhD from the Haas School of Business at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to graduate school, he worked as an industrial engineer at Boeing. After graduating with degrees in economics and music from the University of Puget Sound, Lamar taught at Carnegie Mellon and was one of 3 Harrington Fellows at the University of Texas at Austin from 2011 to 2012. Lamar was formerly the VP of Business Services for Wellspring Worldwide, an IP software company, and has served as Chief Scientific Advisor for Civic Science, an online market research and data science company since its inception in 2007. Lamar lives in St. Louis with his wife, Vincenza, a diabetes and obesity researcher at Washington University Medical School. They split their time between North Idaho and Southern Italy. And if you've noticed, Lamar is in St. Louis remotely with us right now. We'd like to thank you, Lamar, for being with us. There you go.
Great, thanks so much, Gus.
Well, Lamar, first, let me open it up, being that this is such a scientific study.
Yeah.
You know, why don't you walk us through the study, if you could, and just give us a good feeling for where you started, what brought you to it, and some of the results.
So I study a lot of misconduct, and I study a lot of issues of ethics, but I don't think about misconduct or theft as being a moral or even so much as an ethical issue, as much as I think about it being a firm performance issue and a productivity issue. And so what this does is it changes a little bit about the way that we study misconduct, which is that rather than thinking about how do we catch people so we can make the world a better place, it's much more, I think, aligned to what all of you do, which is think about, you know, how can we help out firm performance and outcomes by trying to essentially constrain or change bad behavior. And just as a little background on this, I mean, again, firms is this idea that people are important to organization strategy, and this happens both on the side of productivity, but also on the side of bad behavior. So what we might think is we might think that we as a firm design such as incentives or monitoring to try to improve productivity, and that's often the way that particularly economists have thought about this, which is if you provide high-powered incentives or you provide more monitoring, whether it's for salespeople or whether it's for physicians or surgeons, then maybe you get better performance. But the second side of this, and this is the side that a lot of you deal with, the idea that when you implement a lot of these policies as well, you also have to think about this idea of misconduct, which may be theft, it may be fraud, it may be other things such as sexual harassment, but the same types of issues that impact often productivity and worker performance also can lead to things like cheating by teachers or diagnosis or over-treatment in medical facilities. And so part of the way that I approach these issues is thinking about sort of what the overall impact of this is. And the key thing, and we learned this particularly in the subprime lending crisis, which is the idea that if we just think about performance or productivity, we often can have very distant. So that's the approach I tend to take. the approach I tend to take about people is that a lot of times we tend to kid ourselves into believing that there are a few bad apples out there. And in reality, most of us as people and most employees will, under certain conditions, cross ethical or legal lines. And so this is why your positions are so important, your job roles are so important, is because the right design of an organization, incentives, the right technology can have a dramatic effect in reducing these. It's not simply about hiring the right people and firing the wrong people. It's also about how do you manage those people when you have them in. Because if you think about sort of Bentham's classic with the panopticon, where someone's able to see everything that all of the prisoners are able to do, then this can actually, it's not as simple a solution as we think. And the reason I bring this up is that this study that I'm going to present to you next has been received in a very interesting way. So this is a study that's going to be about monitoring employees. And the initial reaction that I've gotten on National Public Radio and the New York Times about this is this backlash against surveillance. And I think a lot of this is necessitated by the NSA, all the things that are going on with government. What people want to say is, should we monitor or should we surveil employees? And what I always say is that's the wrong question. The right question is but how should we and in ways? And so that's really what this study is about. So let me dig into this in a sec here. But basically the main point here is that if we think about employee misconduct, this is not just a standalone issue where we're trying to minimize losses. That minimizing losses and reducing losses is really a critical part of an entire firm and of the firm's strategy. And your role is I think even more critical in being part of the overall design of the firm. So let me talk to you about my specific study. So what I did was I was studying theft in restaurants, and I know that most of you are in the retail setting, and as I'm sure you probably know, there's a lot of theft in the retail setting, both by customers and by employees. A lot of different estimates on this. Some of the estimates I've seen on restaurants are about $500 a year. But part of the issue with restaurants as well is that you have very, very narrow margins. And so what we were looking at doing is trying to tackle this issue about, what is the value of certain managerial practices, whether they be technology or certain hiring practices, in terms of both reducing theft and hopefully also improve work productivity. And in the case of restaurants, with if you have $500 a year in average losses per employees with very, very thin margins, these losses can be tremendously costly. And so what we look at is we look at a monitoring technology that gets rolled out. And it gets rolled out in a really nice way, which is what we think of as quasi-experimental, which means it gets restaurant locations across time in a way that allows us to really think about what is the impact treatment effect of this. And so this is a product called Restaurant Guard from NCR, which goes into their integrated point of sales system. And the first thing I want to say here is that I've never taken any money from NCR, so this is really a pretty independent study, so I'm not their paid consultant or anything. But they gave me the data and said, here, do what you want with it. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand what was the impact of this. And so what you might imagine is we got this large data of, in this case, it's going to be 394 restaurants. And what we observe across a period of time is we observe a set of restaurants, these 394 restaurants. We see all of their transactions last time. We see estimates of employee theft on a daily basis. We see sales productivity across all their workers. And what happens is across the time in this data is that when Restaurant Guard gets implemented in a restaurant, what that does is it suddenly allows the management to see, starting at that, who's been stealing from them. And so what that essentially does is it puts them over into a treatment category in a quasi-experimental setting. And across time, this happens to multiple restaurants. And so as time moves on, more and more restaurants get treated with this. That is, they get this technology. And what that does is it allows us to say, what is the difference in the productivity of workers and the amount of theft in those workers before and after the implementation of this product relative to other restaurants? And I'll give you a little bit more detail about this. But the important thing about this, and this is one thing in any act research or policy decision, is what this type of rollout does allows us to actually study causality. Because we see a lot of correlations when we do research, which we may see that old people steal less, or maybe old people steal more, or restaurants that are located in Texas steal less, and restaurants that are located in California steal more. But we don't know what's actually causing that. And what this setup allows us to do It allows us through a before and after, and then also one restaurant versus the other, understand sort of what the true causal effect of this is. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, because I know you guys use a lot of different methods for monitoring employees. This is not one of the more complicated ones, so this is not a highly integrated surveillance system with cameras and also transaction data. And I know there are a lot of great ways in which people are doing this now. This is a very, very simple product that essentially is using joint probability to look for suspicious patterns. And so what happens is every week, what happens is basically the company sends out to these restaurants basically alerts of suspicious. So you can imagine this as being a very conservative estimate because they don't want to have false positives. And so they send this out to managers, and they may say, hey, Lamar Pierce stole $84.77 from you, is our rough estimate in here. And then they allow the managers to treat that however they're going to do. And so this is a very, very simple, almost very innocuous product. It's very similar to counting the till. So in no way am I suggesting that this is the best product or the worst product. It is just a simple example of perhaps a minor intervention. And so what happens, and this is important, restaurants split out across the country. So you can see sort of all these locations across 5 chains. And so across time, what happens is these things as they light up, which is hopefully showing up well, is this gets implemented in different places across. This gets rolled out. And this allows us, again, to understand what the difference is in the ones that have now implemented this policy versus the ones that have not. And that's kind of the way that we're going to actually study this. And it ends up being for us in this setting 394 locations in 38 states. And again, this is 5 chains. So I'm not claiming that this is the way that, or this is the impact that this particular product would have on every single chain, because as I'm sure you're all aware, the impact of any monitoring technology on worker behavior is also intimately tied into a number of other elements, such as compensation systems, the culture the organization does with it when they find this information. But this is what essentially we're looking at, is just kind of an average effect across these 5 chains. And there may be some chains, in fact, where this doesn't end up having this big of an effect. And so, yeah, and you excluded Hawaii and Alaska because that would have been complicated. So what we initially see is we see an observable theft decrease of about $24 a week per location, which is, in one sense, not a huge amount of money. So this is an example here, this figure of one chain, locations, one chain. And this is just kind of showing the before and after trends here. And it's basically just, about a $24 a week per location. Again, a conservative estimate. Not a huge amount of money, but if you know anything about the margins on restaurants, it still matters in terms of profitability. What we see that's really fascinating, however, is when this gets implemented, we see a tremendous jump in sales productivity. And what we see is almost $3,000 a week per location, which in this case is about 6 to 7% in terms of total revenue. So this is essentially the equivalent of selling an extra dessert beer to a customer. And actually not to every customer, but if you have a table of 4, this is about the equivalent of, in these type of sort of table service restaurants, of selling somebody at that table an extra beer. So you can imagine cases where restaurant workers actually are able to sell an extra item and try to bump up the revenue. And I'll talk a little bit about why we think we see this. We see this particularly in drink revenue. And the reason why drink revenue is so important, and we see an effect of about $930 a week, is that, if you know anything about restaurants, you know that that's where the money is. It's that there are about 80% margin profits that's coming in. And again, these are not substantial increases. These are, from a standpoint of believability, these are issues of, selling to every 3 or 4 tables an extra beer. So you can imagine this is the case if someone's an excellent server working very hard at it. But it results in a lot of money to the bottom line. And you can see the same thing that happens as well to tip percentage. So if you think that tip percentage is a measure of customer service, what we see is an increase in percentage of about 0.3%, which seems really small, but it's actually really hard to move your average tip percentage up 0.3%. And so the net effective for workers, and this is the critical issue here, you can get a sense of the profit for the firm, which is likely some estimate around 25% increase in profit. But the net impact for a worker actually ends up being almost an additional $1 per hour in tip-based wages. And that's kind of the critical element here, is that by cutting down for workers to steal, what it appears to be doing is it appears to be motivating them to increase their sales to replace that income with tips. We can't say for sure that that's exactly the mechanisms that's happening. There may also be some bump based on non-thieves being more motivated by essentially management cracking down on thieves. But one of the other remarkable things that we see in this study is we see that if you look at sort of at the average work level, you see an average decrease, and this is just a distribution of hourly theft losses per worker. And you can see that the dark line, which is post-treatment or after implementation, versus the dashed line, the pre-treatment, you can see that this all shifts to the left. And again, what we think about is sort of the area under this as being sort of the total. If you look at sales productivity, you see a pretty dramatic shift to the right. This is total check revenue per hour, so you can see it shifts almost up to $90 per hour. Drink sales as well shifts up, tip percentage a little bit as well. So you can see that the workers are getting better. And what this also suggests is that what this policy is doing is it's not replacing bad workers with good workers. It's taking the existing workers that are there and changing their behavior. And in fact, if we look at sort of what we don't observe is we don't see managers using this tool to fire a lot of people. And having interviewed a bunch of managers on this, most of them used it in the following way. Rather than sort of waiting and playing gotcha, what they did is they basically implemented a technology that allowed managers to tell employees, and they didn't actually have to directly tell every employee, they just kind of leak it to the workers, and the workers, of course, all talk amongst themselves, but to tell them, hey, we have this new tool, it's going to allow us to find out if you're stealing, and so that you aren't stealing. But if somebody were to actually steal, we're going to find out about it. And this simple sort of intervention allows workers to not feel accused, not be intervened with, and it simply sort of gives them a warning. And we actually see fewer and fewer people actually leaving the firm. And so what this tends to indicate is the restaurant's doing better, sorry, the workers are doing better, and this is actually a pretty innocuous. Now, a couple other points that I wanted to make about this. So one of the takeaways I think from this is that, in fact, if you think about changing misconduct such as theft, that you have to also think about the implications toward, in this case, what's nice about restaurants is because there's this pay for performance element. If you take away income from theft, they have a way to make that up that actually helps the firm through additional sales. And so this is actually kind of a win-win situation here for the firm. You reduce losses, but it's not just about reducing losses, it's also about increased sales productivity. But the other important thing that I think comes away from this, and this gets back again to this debate, because I've gotten a lot of interesting posts on websites about this, where people have said, how dare you accuse workers of stealing? That's not very nice of you. And they say, surveillance is bad, monitoring is bad. We should just, inspire workers to greatness. And part of the point that I make back to this is that the key here, and this is actually a picture of the Panopticon, which was actually built in the only place you might imagine they built it, which is Cuba, which is an interesting prison. But but it's this idea that the key in reducing a lot of theft is, or stopping terrorism, or whatever you want to think about it, it's not about whether or not you should surveil or whether you should monitor, but it's about what is the right level of monitoring, what is the right type, and how do you communicate that to employees. And that's going to be different for every organization, obviously, and this is why someone like me doesn't stand here and tell you what the right level and type of monitoring for all of your organizations are, because obviously you probably have a better sense about that than I do. But what it does say is it says that what we need to do is we need to change that debate about employee monitoring from being an issue of, is monitoring or surveillance an invasion of, what are sort of justifications and the reasons behind this? Why do we think this is important? Whether it's stopping terrorism, or whether it's making the organization perform better, or whether it's being fair to honest employees, and communicate to employees sort of why this is successful. Because I really think the key to a lot of this very simple technological intervention that we saw here was really about the fact that managers very rarely came out, directly accused people, and directly fired employees. No, hey, look, the game's changed. We know you aren't people, but we just want you to know that, as long as you play fair with us, we're going to play fair with you. And so that gives a pretty good description, I think, of the study. I'm certainly open to questions. I'd love to answer them, or if you have suggestions for me or thoughts on directions of inquiry. That it's always great for me to learn from industry people.
Thanks, Lamar. Is there a way you can give us a brief highlight of the findings of the couple of major points, as you mentioned in your conclusion, as opposed to me reading this? I mean, there's some significant findings that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I had in the slides, I think one of the significant findings is that you implement technologies. You see about a 20%, at least in this setting, a 20% decrease in theft. And remember, this is a very, very innocuous setting. So this is not even putting cameras up. This is a very simple sort of alert system. But more importantly, what you see is a 6% increase in productivity, which is largely dependent on the competence. You see about, at least on RS, about a 20 to 25% increase in profits at the organizational level, at the individual location level, and you see an improvement in customer service. And finally, the other key element here is it's not necessary to fire people to get these gains. The solution is not to replace bad apples with good apples, but rather to set up a system where employees can succeed.
Well, one of the things that I saw was, in your final conclusion, was that it is as important to implement an IT monitoring system as it is to have a strong pre-employment screening program, that almost the two are parallel.
Yeah, no, I think that's I think traditionally, human resources have focused on this idea that there are bad employees and there are good employees. If we can just find who the bad employees are and screen them out, that's going to solve all the problems we have. And one of the things that I've learned from broadly studying misconduct and ethics is that the vast majority of people, if you set them up to fail, will fail. And so you can't screen out the 80% of the population that has the capability to do wrong. So a critical part of this, and perhaps even a more important part of this, is taking the employees that you have and through a system of providing the right incentives and the right monitoring and information and management practices to set them up to succeed. And that's a lot of what I know you in the room do, which is this idea that essentially working with the employees you have rather than just thinking about this as a hiring and firing process.
Mm-hmm. Ed Wolfe with WG Security Products. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, Dr. Pierce, what percentage of the restaurants told their associates ahead of time that when they implemented the monitoring system?
So I actually don't know that because we weren't allowed to go through and actually survey all of the people that participated in this. There were a few chains and a few locations that sort of allowed, essentially we didn't know what the chains were. So basically the NCR sort of made contacts for us and some of the restaurants allowed us to sort of talk to their managers. All of the managers that we talked to essentially leaked it. And in some cases they did this in a group meeting, but a lot of the time what they did actually would tell one sort of influential employee and let it spill out across the other. But I wish we could go through and do a comprehensive survey to find out exact management practices where they made this effective. So I just don't know that from the data exactly.
But you saw a 20% improvement in loss.
Yeah, we saw about a 20%, and we think that's a conservative estimate because the way that loss is being backed out here is, and you guys know that it's always hard to figure out what the true level of loss is, unless you're really looking at all of the inventory systems and everything. The way, essentially what they're determining as loss is things that they are with essentially 95% confidence sure is cash theft. And because this is revenue theft rather than inventory theft, you don't know all of the revenue that was coming in. So it's a very conservative estimate of the actual amount. But if you assume that the amount is actually reflective percentage that you actually.
And you made a comment about a 67% increase in productivity on the part of the 22,000 employees that you surveyed.
No, sorry. It's about, sorry, a 627%.
Okay, got it.
So
Sorry, we're on the internet.
647%.
Certainly.
Yeah, 67 would be pretty impressive. Yeah, so a 627% increase. But again, remember, in restaurants, like the margins are so thin, and so many of these sales, like the drink sales, are pure profits. That what that ends up being is a 20 to 25% increase in profits.
Significant. Any more questions?
No. I think what it does bring out, though, it makes it very clear that in a very successful, effective loss prevention organization, you do need a lot of different planks of your program. Certainly one is background screening, then you do some POS monitoring, and then the other steps of whether you want to monitor them on closed-circuit TV or not. But it does make it very clear that that point-of-sale monitoring, as a lot of us know, has been effective for years.
And not only reduces theft, but increases productivity on the part of the employees, which has a bottom line effect for the entire company. Well, Lamar, I want to thank you for being with us today, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, folks.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for being here, and that's it for this session of the LPNN.